I Love to Singa, 1936. 14 Strange Things from Warner Bros.' jazz cartoon era. In 1936, I Love to Singa emerged as more than just a musical cartoon. It was a direct clash between rigid tradition and emerging popular culture. Welcomed with enthusiasm by the adult audience of the time, the short hid strange decisions, from the no jazz sign as a silent visual rule, to the use of the radio as a cultural judge, to subtle rhythm changes when jazz invades the screen. None of this is innocent. To understand why, you have to start with the first almost invisible detail. Fact 1. The no jazz sign reveals the conflict before any dialogue. In the very first seconds of I Love to Singa, the central conflict is already exposed without a single line of dialogue. The camera frames the owl's house like a rigid conservatory, with a prominent sign, no jazz. It is not casual decoration. The warning functions as an absolute visual rule, placed below the father's professional name, turning the home into an extension of musical repression. Before the protagonist even sings, the viewer understands that prohibition, surveillance, and punishment exist there. Tex Avery builds this idea through scene composition, not verbal exposition. The framing forces the eye to read the sign, creating a silent tension between tradition and individual desire. Notice also the absence of movement in this moment. Everything is static, formal, almost suffocating. Jazz has not yet appeared, but its presence is already felt as a threat. This detail goes unnoticed by most because it happens too quickly, but it defines the entire emotional arc of the short. When jazz finally enters, it does not just break musical rules, it breaks a domestic law already declared visually, and that choice reveals how the cartoon trusts images more than text to tell its story. Fact 2. When the cartoon was, in fact, a musical advertisement, I Love to Singa was not born only as entertainment, but as part of a very clear commercial strategy by Warner Brothers in the 1930s. At that time, the Merry Melodies cartoons essentially functioned as showcases for newly released songs owned by the studio itself. The logic was simple. The more memorable the short, the greater the chance the audience would leave the theater wanting to buy the sheet music or the record. The story came after the music, not the other way around. That is why the title song appears repeatedly and dominates the cartoon's rhythm even when it interrupts the narrative flow. This approach explains why the plot feels almost like a pretext for successive musical performances. Leon Schlesinger understood that the real value of the cartoon was off-screen, in the sales generated after the screening. Tex Avery was still operating within that system, even as he began to stretch it with humor and visual exaggeration. The result is a short that feels spontaneous, but was carefully calculated to stick in the viewer's memory. The music does not accompany the animation. It is the central product, and everything else revolves around it, including characters, conflict, and resolution. Fact 3. The protagonist does not play instruments, he only sings, unlike his brothers who appear playing violin, flute, and singing opera with rigid posture and exaggerated technique. The protagonist of I Love to Singa never touches an instrument. He sings with his whole body, using loose gestures, physical sway, and internal rhythm. This visual choice is not accidental. On screen, the contrast makes it clear that the conflict is not only musical, but also physical. The brothers represent mechanical discipline. The protagonist represents impulse and spontaneity. Behind the scenes, this decision also simplified the animation, reducing repetitive bowing and blowing movements, which helped keep costs low without losing impact. At the same time, the choice reinforces the direct reference to Al Jolson, whose public image was tied to vocal presence and physical charisma, not instrumental performance. Tex Avery uses this apparent limitation as a narrative advantage, focusing the viewer's attention on performance rather than technique. The result is a character who always seems out of place in that environment, even when standing still. He does not belong in that world because his talent does not fit within the house's visual rules. Before he is expelled, that difference already silently condemns him. Fact 4. The visual rhythm changes at the exact moment jazz enters. Until jazz explicitly appears, I Love to Singa operates in a controlled, almost ceremonial tempo. Movements are short, predictable, and the staging favors symmetry and repetition. That changes the instant the protagonist begins to sing jazz in secret. His body starts to occupy more space in the frame, gestures become elastic, and the rhythm of actions noticeably accelerates. But the animation abandons its earlier rigidity and adopts irregular pauses, lateral sway, and small physical improvisations that mimic musical swing. It is not just the soundtrack. The visual language falls out of step with the parents' world. Tex Avery synchronizes action and music to make jazz feel like an invasive force, something that cannot be contained by traditional framing. This rupture happens too quickly to be rationalized by the viewer, but it is felt. Jazz seems alive because the animation reacts to it. When the father returns to the scene, the rhythm locks up again, as if time itself were being repressed. This alternation builds the conflict without speeches. Jazz literally gives motion back to the cartoon. Fact 5. Parodying the jazz singer was still dangerous in 1936. When I Love to Singa reached theaters, the jazz singer was not yet a distant classic. It was a living reference, immediately recognized by adult audiences. The 1927 film was only 9 years old and still circulated as a symbol of the transition from silent to sound cinema. Turning that story into an animated parody was risky because it played with a recent cultural icon and with a sensitive theme, the clash between family tradition and popular artistic expression. The short replicates the film's structure almost without disguise. The authoritarian father, the improper talent, the expulsion, and the redemption before an audience. The difference is tone. Tex Avery uses exaggeration and humor to soften a conflict that, in the original, was treated with dramatic weight. That made the cartoon acceptable for theaters, but still provoked immediate recognition. The audience knew exactly what they were laughing at. This temporal proximity explains why the short feels bolder than it may seem today. It does not revisit an ancient myth. It mocks a success still fresh in collective memory. Fact 6. Jack Bunny is not just a joke, it is a direct portrait of 1930s radio. The character Jack Bunny passes by too quickly for many to realize how firmly he anchors I Love to Singa in the real world of 1936. He does not represent just a generic host, but an immediate portrait of the type of announcer who dominated American radio at the time. The caricature directly evokes the style of Jack Benny, famous for controlling the program's pace with sarcasm, dry interruptions, and calculated disdain for amateurs. On screen, Jack Bunny barely looks at the participants. He decides fates with a mechanical gesture, activating the logic of disposable entertainment. Behind the scenes, this choice connected the cartoon to the adult audience's daily life, which recognized that behavior as radio routine. The stage is not magical or welcoming. It is an entertainment assembly line. Visually, the framing reinforces this by keeping Jack Bunny elevated and motionless, while candidates enter and exit the frame quickly. The protagonist's jazz only works there because it breaks that coldness. He does not win through delicacy, but through presence, and that sets the stage for the next conflict. Fact 7. The expulsion happens too fast to be just a joke. The scene in which the father expels the protagonist from the house
in the cup. Anything with a you and I love you. And
enough is too much. Out of my house, you.
is short, dry, and brutally efficient. There is no long argument, no real attempt to listen. A single moment of jazz is enough to cross the line, and the punishment comes almost instantly. Visually, everything happens in a few seconds, creating an uncomfortable effect when observed closely. The speed of the expulsion turns the gesture into something disproportionate, even within comedic logic. Tex Avery builds the scene without melodrama. The father explodes, the door slams, and the protagonist's world ends right there. Humor covers the action, but does not soften its impact. This accelerated rhythm reflects real behaviors of the time, when cultural deviations were treated as direct affronts to family authority. The cartoon does not ask for empathy for the father. It simply records the act and moves on. Precisely because it does not linger emotionally, the scene feels harsher. The expulsion is not the story's climax, but a disposable obstacle, and that reveals how banalized repression was. Laughter exists, but it does not erase the violence of the gesture. Fact 8. Important voices went uncredited by studio decision. In I Love to Singa, several of the short's most memorable voices simply do not appear in the original credits. This was not forgetfulness or a technical error. It was a common practice in Leon Schlesinger's productions to keep voice actors formally unrecognized, especially in low-budget shorts of the 1930s. Artists like Billy Bletcher, Tommy Bond, and Jackie Morrow gave full full personality to the characters, but rarely received public acknowledgement. For the studio, the star was supposed to be the cartoon, never the performer. In addition, keeping voices anonymous gave more contractual control and prevented individual talents from gaining bargaining power. On screen, this lack of credit creates a curious effect. Memorable characters with no associated identity. The audience remembered the voice, the timbre, and the exaggeration, but not who was behind it. This erasure helps explain why many voice actors from that era were rediscovered decades later by historians. The cartoon sells presence and charisma, but the industry behind it operated in silence. And that pattern influenced how animation was treated as disposable labor for many years. Fact 9. The protagonist's vocal defect only appears when he is forced into the classical style. Whenever the protagonist is forced to sing classical music, something strange happens to his body and his voice. He goes off key, stumbles in rhythm, and develops a kind of nervous tic that does not exist when he sings jazz. Visually, this is not treated as a lack of talent, but as a physical reaction to repression. The framing tightens, shoulders hunch, and bodily movement loses fluidity, making it clear that this style does not belong to him. The contrast becomes even more evident because, seconds earlier, the same character moved with confidence while singing jazz. Tex Avery uses this discrepancy as a visual comment. Imposed art sickens, chosen art liberates. Behind the scenes, this decision also allowed physical humor to be explored without explaining anything in dialogue. The audience did not need to understand musical theory to grasp the discomfort. They just had to watch the body react. The defect is not in the character, but in the context that tries to force him into a mold. When he returns to jazz, the tic disappears instantly, and that silent recovery is one of the short's most subtle critiques. Fact 10. The radio acts as both villain and savior. In I Love to Singa, the radio occupies an ambiguous role that is rarely discussed. It first appears as a threat, spreading impersonal voices, cruel contests, and instant judgment. The show's stage offers no welcome. Candidates enter and vanish in a hurry, treated as disposable material. Visually, the radio studio is cold, geometric, almost industrial, contrasting with the family's organic home. Still, it is precisely this environment that allows the protagonist to exist outside domestic repression. The radio exposes, but it also legitimizes. By broadcasting his voice, it turns a family deviation into a public spectacle. This detail is crucial because it reflects the reality of the 1930s, when radio was beginning to break cultural boundaries and generate instant fame. Tex Avery does not paint the medium as a pure hero or villain. The radio does not understand jazz, but it amplifies those who perform it. It does not defend the protagonist, it simply makes him audible. When the family hears him through the airwaves, the private conflict inevitably becomes public. And once public, it can no longer be ignored. Jazz wins not through intimate acceptance, but through exposure. Fact 11. Tex Avery did not yet have full creative control here. When I Love to Singa was produced, Tex Avery was still operating within a rigid system commanded by Leon Schlesinger. He did not have full autonomy to break with traditional narrative structures, especially in shorts that had to fulfill a clear commercial function. Even so, the cartoon reveals signs of the style Avery would later develop. The humor is drier, conflicts are presented without excessive sentimentality, and adult authority is never fully respected. Still, the conciliatory ending is not a purely authorial choice, but a studio requirement. The father must accept jazz, the family must remain intact. Avery pushes boundaries where he can, accelerating the brutality of the expulsion, exaggerating authority figures, and treating emotion as almost disposable, but he stops short of real confrontation. This turns the short into a curiously contained piece, subversive on the surface, conservative in its final tie-up. It is precisely this tension that makes I Love to Singa so revealing about its period. It shows a director trying to break rules while still learning how far he can go, and it prepares the ground for much more aggressive works to come. Fact 12. The happy ending resolves too quickly because of contractual obligation. The reconciliation happens abruptly, almost hurriedly, and this is no narrative coincidence. After a heavy conflict, expulsion, and public exposure, everything is resolved in a few seconds with a gesture of acceptance. There is no real conversation, no apology, no deep transformation. The conflict is simply shut down. This speed serves less the emotional logic of the story and more the studio requirements of the time. Shorts had to end light, conciliatory, and without leaving uncomfortable residue with the audience. Rebellion could exist, but only up to a point. On screen, this is clear in the rhythm. The father changes position, the prize is handed over, and family status is restored almost automatically. Jazz's victory is not a revolution, it is a silent agreement. entertainment. The system does not change, it simply makes a temporary exception. This type of ending was designed to reassure conservative audiences without completely erasing the cultural conflict presented. The result is an ending that seems positive, but when examined closely, reveals the exact limit of how far that story was allowed to go. Fact 13, the short went through silent cuts that changed its historical meaning. Over the decades, the cartoon was not just re-released, it was quietly adjusted. In different re-editions and television broadcasts, specific segments were removed or shortened without clear contextualization for the audience. The goal was not to preserve the work, but to make it more acceptable to new cultural standards and children's programming. The problem is that these changes are not accompanied by historical explanation, which distorts the original reading. Elements that helped explain the cultural clash of the 1930s were softened, creating the false impression that the conflict was always harmless. This practice produces a fragmented work. The modern viewer consumes a version that seems more innocent than it really was. As a result, the cartoon continues to circulate, but emptied of part of its original discomfort. Instead of confronting the past, it is polished until it fits better into family programming schedules and digital catalogs. The result is preservation by amputation. The work survives, but not in its most honest form. Fact 14, the short still unsettles because it was never made for children. The discomfort this work still provokes does not come from the time that has passed, but from what remains recognizable. The central conflict is not cute or pedagogical. It revolves around control, conditional acceptance, and public validation. None of this was created with an isolated child audience in mind. In the 1930s, cartoons were shown alongside adult films, consumed by audiences who understood cultural references, radio, the music market, and generational conflict. When the short is reread today as innocent entertainment, something is lost. It starts to seem too simple, when in fact it carries deeply uncomfortable tension. The modern attempt to push it into the children's territory creates a historical disconnect. The result is a product that feels strange to children and unsettling to attentive adults. The cartoon did not age badly, it simply stopped having its context respected, and perhaps that is exactly why it still draws attention. It reminds us that animation was once used to talk about money, cultural power, and family repression with no intention of softening the message. When looked at closely, this cartoon reveals more about cultural limits than about music. It masks repression with humor, accelerates conflicts to make them acceptable, and resolves everything before it gets too serious. Even so, it leaves visual traces that are hard to ignore. The discomfort remains because the work does not ask for the viewer's innocence. It asks for attention. And that makes it strangely current.